Some betrayals don't come with warnings, just a single moment that shatters everything. Welcome back to Wives Gone Wild. Thanks for joining us today. Where are you listening from? We love knowing where these untamed stories reach. Now, let's dive into today's wild tale. I'm Brian, and I thought I had it all. A love that felt unbreakable, a marriage built on trust. But life has a way of showing you just how fragile those things really are. Alan and I had only been married 3 months, and I was still adjusting to the sheer luck of having her by my side. She wasn't just beautiful, she was radiant. Her dark hair caught the light in a way that made my heart skip. She moved with confidence, an athlete's grace in tight jeans and a crisp white blouse. She never wore a bra when we were together, teasing me with the knowledge that she was mine. We were heading into the mountains for a 2-week hunting trip, our second one together. Alan had been raised around elk and deer up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. She was a natural with a bow, more skilled than most men I knew. I wasn't much of a bow hunter myself, but I respected it. As she walked toward the truck, I caught myself staring, still in awe that she chose me. She turned back, catching my gaze. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. "I just can't get over how beautiful you are," I admitted, unable to hold back the thought. She smiled, a small, knowing smirk that sent warmth through my chest. Our marriage was fresh, exciting, and filled with the kind of closeness that made the idea of a future family feel inevitable. But for now, we just wanted to enjoy this time together. No distractions, no stress, just the wilderness and us. We had met in college during our senior year, and from the first moment, I knew she was different. She was sharp, witty, and adventurous, qualities that made me fall hard. And she was mine, or so I thought. The drive from Colorado was long, so we stopped overnight in Des Moines before pushing on to the lodge the next evening. That's where we met them, our hunting guides. Peter Thompson was the first, wiry, in his late 40s, and built like a cowboy straight out of an old western. He was friendly enough, but my attention wasn't on him. Because then there was Rains Parker. At 6 feet 5 inches, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him, Rains was the kind of man you noticed. His long black hair was tied back, his muscular frame barely contained by his jacket. He didn't speak much. Peter even joked that in all their years together, he'd barely heard 500 words from the guy. But Alan noticed him, and something about the way she looked at him. That was the first crack. A hairline fracture in something I had thought was unbreakable. I just didn't know it yet. The hunting lodge was warm, rustic, and smelled of cedar and old leather. Alan and I settled in, ready to enjoy what should have been another unforgettable trip together. I remember thinking how lucky we were. This was the kind of life we had dreamed of. Peter, our guide, poured us glasses of red wine over dinner, chatting about past hunts and close calls with bears. Alan, always the competitor, leaned in when he mentioned a record-breaking moose they had tracked last season. "How big was it?" she asked, eyes gleaming with interest. Peter chuckled. "Big enough that it took 4 of us to drag it out." Across the table, Rain sat silent, tearing into his meal with slow, deliberate bites. There was something unsettling about how quiet he was, how still. He wasn't unfriendly, just unreadable. But Alan? She noticed him. I saw the way her eyes lingered when she thought I wasn't looking. Not obvious, not flirtatious, just an extra second here, a glance there. A curiosity. I forced myself to ignore it. Rains finally spoke when Alan asked about his weapon of choice. "Do you hunt with a bow?" she asked, wiping her hands on a napkin. He nodded, his voice deep, almost a rumble. "Yeah." Alan leaned forward slightly. "What kind?" Rains put his fork down, finally giving her his full attention. 70-pound recurve. Handmade. Alan's eyes flickered with something, admiration, excitement. "You built it yourself?" she asked. Another nod. "Most of it." She was hooked. I could feel it, even if she hadn't realized it yet. I forced a laugh and took a sip of wine. "I'll stick to my rifle," I said. "Leave the medieval weapons to you two." Peter clapped me on the back. "Good call, Brian. Let them play Robin Hood while we go home with a guaranteed catch." Everyone laughed. Everyone except Rains. He just stared at Alan, and she stared back. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, Alan seemed distracted, replaying the evening in her mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushing out her dark hair, lost in thought. "Excited for tomorrow?" I asked, pulling off my shirt. "Yeah," she said, but her voice was distant. I came up behind her, pressing a kiss to her shoulder, inhaling the faint scent of pine and firewood in her hair. "You seem off." She turned to me with a soft smile, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "Just tired. Long drive." Maybe that was true. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I felt it, the first tremor of something shifting beneath our feet. Something I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, the mountains greeted us with crisp air and the scent of damp earth. The kind of morning that makes you feel alive. Alan and I stood by the truck, tightening the straps on our packs as the sun peeked over the horizon. This was it, the moment we had been waiting for. 2 weeks of hunting, adventure, and time alone together. Except we weren't alone. Peter and I took one trail. Alan and Rains took another. "We'll meet back here by sundown," Peter called over his shoulder. Alan flashed me a quick smile. "Good luck." And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the wilderness with a man I barely knew. The air felt heavier than it had a moment before. The day stretched on, slow and uneventful. Peter and I tracked a few elk, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Normally, I would have been content just being out there, surrounded by the raw beauty of the mountains. But my mind wasn't on the hunt. It was on Alan. I trusted her. Of course I did. We were married. We were solid. But trust and instinct don't always align. And my instincts were screaming at me. It wasn't until the sun dipped behind the ridgeline that we returned to camp. Peter and I were the first back. We unloaded our gear, kicked back by the fire, and waited. And waited. The sky turned deep orange, then indigo, then black. Finally, I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Alan and Rains. They walked side by side into the firelight, their faces flushed from the cold. Alan was grinning, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. Rains, as usual, was unreadable. "Any luck?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Alan shook her head. "Not today, but tomorrow's looking good." Her tone was light, normal, but something about the way she said it, about the way she looked at him when she did, sent an uncomfortable jolt through me. I searched for something, anything, in Rain's expression. A smirk, a flicker of something he shouldn't be feeling. But there was nothing. Just a man. A man I wasn't sure I could trust. We sat around the fire, eating in comfortable silence. But beneath it, something else simmered, something unspoken, something I could no longer ignore. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The kind of air that wakes you up, sharpens your senses. The kind of air that makes you feel like you belong out here, in the wild, with nothing but instinct to guide you. Alan and I stood by the truck, checking our gear. She adjusted the strap on her bow, her fingers working with practiced ease. I watched her, that familiar warmth creeping into my chest. God, she was beautiful. Capable. "Ready?" I asked, tightening my pack. She grinned. "Always. This trip, it was supposed to be ours. A chance to disconnect from the world, to just be together." But then Peter broke the moment. "Brian, you're with me. Alan, you're with Rains." The words settled over me like a stone in my gut. I turned to Alan, waiting for her to protest, to insist we stick together. But she didn't. She just nodded, slipping her quiver over her shoulder. "We'll meet back at sundown," Peter added, tightening his gloves. Alan flashed me a quick smile. "Good luck." And then she was gone, walking into the trees beside Rains. I watched them disappear into the towering pines, their figures swallowed by the forest. And for the first time since we got here, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The day stretched on. Peter and I hiked through thick brush, tracking a herd that had moved through the valley at dawn. We saw signs, hoof prints in the mud, broken twigs, fresh scat, but nothing close enough to take a shot. I should have been focused on the hunt, on the thrill of it, but my mind kept drifting. To her, to him, to them. The thought was ridiculous, right? Alan was my wife. She loved me. But trust isn't always louder than instinct. And my instincts? They were whispering something I didn't want to hear. By late afternoon, we called it. No shots fired. No tags filled. Just miles of silence stretching between me and my own thoughts. We made it back to camp just as the sun dipped low, casting gold and crimson through the trees. I threw down my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and exhaled. Now we waited. And waited. The sky darkened. The fire crackled. The whiskey in my flask burned down my throat. Still, no sign of them. Then, finally, footsteps. I turned, and there they were. Alan and Rains, stepping out of the shadows, their breath rising in thin clouds. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair messy from the wind. And she was smiling. Smiling. Like she had just had the best day of her life. Something inside me tensed. I forced a grin. Any luck? Alan shook her head, pulling off her gloves. Not today, but tomorrow's looking good. Normal words. Normal tone. But there was something else. The way she said it. The way she looked at him when she did. A flicker of something. Quick. Subtle. But there. I looked at Rains, searching for a sign. Smugness. Arrogance. A crack in that unreadable expression. Nothing. Just a man standing there, his hands by his sides, his face impassive. And yet, something had shifted. We sat around the fire, eating in near silence, the only sound the occasional crack of burning wood. And in that silence, I knew. This wasn't just another hunting trip. Something else was hunting us. The wind howled through the canyon, biting against my exposed skin as I adjusted my hood. The temperature had dropped fast, the mountains shifting from crisp autumn air to something colder, more merciless. Alan and Rains were still gone. I watched the tree line, my fingers gripping the tin cup of coffee tighter than necessary. Peter sat across from me, sharpening his knife like we had all the time in the world. They should be back by now, I muttered, more to myself than him. Peter glanced up, unfazed. They'll be fine. Rains knows these mountains like the back of his hand. That wasn't the point. The storm was rolling in fast. Heavy clouds pressed low over the peaks, a promise of snow in the air. And Alan, she was out there. Alone. With him. I forced the thought away, standing up to stoke the fire. I needed to trust her. I needed to trust that she was out there focused on the hunt, not. Footsteps. I spun toward the sound. Alan emerged from the darkness, her figure barely visible in the dim glow of the firelight. Rains followed a few steps behind her, his presence looming even in the shadows. They were soaked. Alan's jacket was slick with melted snow, her hair damp and clinging to her face. Her lips were tinged blue, her hands trembling slightly as she unbuckled her pack. "You okay?" I asked, stepping forward. She smiled, breathless. "Yeah, storm caught us off guard. We had to find shelter for a bit." "Shelter?" My gut twisted. "Where?" Rains answered this time, his voice steady, casual. "Found a cave a few miles up. Waited it out." A cave. Alone. For hours. The thought lodged itself in my throat like a stone. I looked at Alan, searching for something, an answer, a reassurance, anything. But she was busy stripping off her wet gloves, laughing softly as Peter tossed her a blanket. Laughing. Like this was just another adventure. Like this was normal. But nothing about this felt normal. I sat beside her by the fire, my pulse thrumming in my ears as she reached her hands toward the warmth. "You should change," I said, keeping my voice even. "You're freezing." She nodded, standing up. "I'll be right back." And just like that, she was gone again, disappearing into the cabin. Rains stood by the fire, hands in his pockets, staring into the flames. He wasn't shivering. The storm had passed. But something inside me told me the worst was yet to come. That night, I barely slept. Alan lay beside me in our cabin, her body curled beneath thick blankets, her breathing slow and steady. Peaceful. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't spent hours alone in a cave with him. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The storm had passed, but it left behind something heavier. Something I couldn't shake. I told myself I was being paranoid. That Alan was mine. That she had always been mine. But trust isn't just something you say. It's something you feel. And right now, I felt like a man standing on a frozen lake, hearing the ice crack beneath his feet. The next morning, Alan was up early. Too early. I heard her whispering to Peter near the fire outside, her voice light, excited. "If we leave before sunrise, we can make it to the ridge before they move." She was talking about the elk, the hunt, the reason we were here. But she wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Rains. I stepped out of the cabin, rubbing sleep from my eyes, trying to act normal, trying to remind myself that I had nothing to worry about. "Morning," I said, wrapping an arm around Alan's waist. She leaned into me, warm and familiar. For a moment, I exhaled. Then Rains spoke. "We should get moving." Alan straightened, stepping away from me, her focus shifting entirely to him. "We." Not Alan and me. Not husband and wife. "We." I bit the inside of my cheek, forcing myself to stay calm. Alan glanced back at me, smiling. We'll be back by mid-afternoon. I should have stopped her. I should have told her to stay with me, to let someone else go with Rains. But I didn't. Because deep down, I needed to know. If I was wrong, if this was all in my head, then nothing would happen. And if I was right, then I was already too late. The day passed like slow poison. I couldn't focus on anything. Couldn't shake the image of them together, alone, miles away from me. Every scenario ran through my head, each worse than the last. Peter tried to distract me with talk of past hunts, of record-breaking elk, but I barely heard him. I just waited. For her. For the moment she'd come back through those trees and prove me wrong. And then, at sunset, she did. Alan walked into camp, her cheeks flushed, her hair wind-tousled. And Rains was right beside her. I searched her face, waiting for something to tell me I had been a fool, that I had overthought it. But then, she looked at him. Not for long. Not obvious. Just a flicker. A breath. A second too long. And it was enough. Something had happened. Something that could never be undone. I just didn't know what. Not yet. Alan was different when she came back. Not obvious. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. The way she avoided my eyes. The way she smiled just a little too quickly, a little too bright, like she was trying to cover something up. And the way she was quiet that night, sitting by the fire with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames. I sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, but not close enough to touch. How was it? I asked, keeping my voice even. She exhaled, a slow breath through her nose. Good. Long. We almost had one, but he got spooked. I waited for her to say more, to say something that would make me feel better. But she didn't. Instead, she stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. I'm exhausted. I think I'll turn in early. And just like that, she left me alone by the fire. I gave her space. For the next 2 days, I convinced myself that I was wrong, that I was imagining things, that I wasn't losing her. But doubt doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It festers, grows, becomes something else entirely. And then, on the third night, I heard her. It was late. The fire outside had burned low, and Peter was already asleep in his tent. I was lying awake in our cabin, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the sound. Soft footsteps. Moving past me. Moving toward the door. I turned my head just in time to see Alan slip outside, her silhouette ghostly in the moonlight. I didn't want to follow. I didn't want to know. But I had to. I kept my distance as I trailed her through the dark, my pulse hammering in my throat. She moved quickly, like she had done this before. Like she knew exactly where she was going. The trees stretched high above us, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots. And then she stopped. A few yards ahead, Rain stepped into view. Waiting. She didn't hesitate. She walked right to him. And I watched, helpless, frozen, as she reached up and touched his arm. The touch was small, brief, but it may as well have been a gunshot. Because in that moment, everything shattered. Everything I thought I knew. Everything I thought we were. I turned before I could hear what she said. Before I could see anything else. Because I already knew. I had lost her. I just wasn't ready to let her go. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above me, my mind replaying what I had seen. Alan. In the dark. With him. I had seen enough. Enough to know she wasn't mine anymore. By the time the first light broke through the trees, my decision was made. Breakfast was quiet. Too quiet. Peter talked about tracking conditions, the weather shift, the best place to set up camp tomorrow. Alan nodded along, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled too tightly around her mug. She knew. Maybe not that I had seen her, but she knew something had changed. She could feel it. I waited until we were alone. Just the two of us, standing at the edge of camp, the distant sound of the river breaking the silence between us. I turned to her. Alan. She looked up, eyes wary. Yeah. I studied her face, searching for something. Remorse, guilt, anything. All I saw was fear. And that's when I knew. She wasn't going to tell me. She was going to let it sit there, festering between us, eating away at what we had until there was nothing left. I exhaled slowly. Is there something you want to tell me? For a second, just a second, I saw the hesitation. The way her lips parted like she might say something. Then she swallowed hard and shook her head. No. What? Lie. A clean, simple lie. And that was it. The moment everything between us broke. Because it wasn't just the betrayal that burned. It was the fact that she could stand here, look me in the eyes, and pretend. I nodded once, sharp and final. Okay. She frowned. Okay. I turned away. Yeah. Okay. I let the silence hang, stretching long enough for her to feel it. And then I walked away. Because if she wasn't going to end this, I would. The morning after her lie, I made up my mind. We were leaving. The trip was over. I packed our gear with mechanical precision, each item a small defiance, a silent declaration that I was done pretending, done waiting for her to tell me the truth. Alan didn't fight it. She didn't ask why. She just packed her own things quietly, stuffing her clothes into her bag without meeting my eyes. That told me everything. The drive home was long. The kind of long that has nothing to do with miles and everything to do with the weight sitting between us. Alan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching the trees blur past like she was anywhere but here. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my knuckles white, my jaw locked. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Because what was left to say? That I knew? That I saw her? That I had felt the moment she stopped being mine? That I had loved her with everything I had? And she threw it away for a man whose name I could barely say without tasting bile? No, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation, because that would mean I still cared, that I was still holding on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. Instead, I let the silence speak for me, and with every mile, it got louder. By the time we pulled into our driveway, night had fallen. Alan sat still for a moment, gripping the handle of her bag like she was bracing for something. I killed the engine and exhaled. Go inside, I said, my voice flat, emotionless. I need a minute. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she nodded, stepping out of the truck without a word. I watched her walk up the steps, unlock the door, and disappear inside. And as soon as she was gone, I gripped the steering wheel, my chest tight, my head pounding. Because now I had to figure out what came next. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. Too quiet. Alan sat at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of her. She didn't look up when I walked in. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her. At the woman I had built a life with. The woman I had trusted. The woman who had betrayed me. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Say it. She flinched, like she had been expecting it, but still wasn't ready. Brian. No. No more stalling. No more pretending. Say it. Her fingers curled around the glass, but she didn't lift it. She just stared at the dark liquid inside, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. A mistake, I repeated, shaking my head. That's what we're calling it. Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw it there. Guilt, regret, something that almost looked like grief. Almost. I don't know what to say, she murmured. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my voice low and sharp. You could start with the truth. She swallowed hard. I didn't plan for it to happen. I swear, Brian. It was the storm, the cold, we were. Don't. The word came out harsher than I intended, but I meant it. I didn't want excuses. I didn't want her to tell me how it wasn't her fault, how circumstances pushed her into another man's arms. Because the truth was simple. She chose him. And now she was sitting here, trying to convince herself that she hadn't. Do you love him? I asked, my voice steady, even though everything inside me felt like it was cracking apart. Her breath hitched. No. I studied her face, searching for the lie. She held my gaze, but I wasn't sure if she was trying to convince me, or herself. I nodded, slow and final. Okay. Alan's lips parted, like she wanted to say something, but I was already standing, already walking away, because it didn't matter anymore. She had finally told the truth, and it changed nothing. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the wall, my mind blank. All I knew was that something inside me had snapped. I turned back to her, my voice calm, too calm. So what now, Alan? She looked up, startled. I saw the panic in her eyes, the desperate scramble for a way out of this moment. A way to fix what she had broken. But there was no fixing this. Not now. Not ever. I don't know, she whispered. I laughed, a hollow sound that didn't feel like mine. You don't know? Alan flinched, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like she was bracing for impact. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the surface between us. Let me make it easy for you. She sucked in a sharp breath, waiting. And then I said it. I'm done. The words hung between us, heavy, irreversible. Her face crumpled. Brian. Don't. My voice was steel. Don't say my name like it still means something to you. Tears welled in her eyes. It does. I shook my head. No, it doesn't. Not enough. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back. The smallest movement, but it felt like severing a lifeline. Alan exhaled, shaky. We can get past this. I laughed again, but there was no humor in it. You really believe that? I have to, she whispered. And that was the problem. She wasn't fighting for us. She was fighting to erase her guilt, to convince herself that she hadn't just burned our life to the ground. I straightened, stepping back, putting space between us. You want forgiveness? She nodded desperately. Yes. I studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, I said, I don't have it to give. Alan's breath hitched like I had just struck her. Maybe I had. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just emptiness. I turned away, my voice quiet but final. Pack your things. Alan let out a broken sob. Brian, please. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. Because there was nothing left to say. Alan didn't leave that night. She sat in the living room for hours, curled up on the couch, staring at nothing. Every now and then, I caught her looking at me, like she wanted to say something. But she never did, and I wasn't going to break the silence for her. I had nothing left to give. By morning, her bags were packed. She stood by the door, gripping the handle of her suitcase so tightly her knuckles turned white. Where will you go? I asked, my voice flat. She swallowed hard. I don't know yet. I nodded. Because it didn't matter. I wasn't going to ask her to stay. And she wasn't going to beg me to let her. Not after what she did. Not after I told her I was done. She hesitated for a second, shifting her weight like she was waiting for something. One last chance. One last moment. But I wasn't giving her one. She exhaled shakily and reached for the doorknob. Then, just before stepping out, she turned back to me. Brian. I clenched my jaw, bracing for whatever she was about to say. I really did love you. Past tense. She didn't even realize she had said it that way. I nodded once. Yeah, me too. And then, without another word, she walked out. I listened as the door clicked shut, as her footsteps faded down the porch, as her car rumbled to life. And then, nothing. Just silence. The kind that settles into your bones. The kind that tells you a part of your life is over, and you don't even get to fight for it. I didn't move for a long time. Didn't breathe. Didn't think. Because if I let myself feel it, really feel it, there would be no coming back. And right now, I needed to survive this. I could break later. But not now. Not yet. The house felt different after she left. Empty in a way that wasn't just physical. I walked through the living room, past the spot where she had sat the night before. Her glass of whiskey was still there, untouched. A ghost of what we had been. I didn't touch it. Didn't clean it up. Because I wasn't ready to erase her just yet. Days passed. Then weeks. People talk about heartbreak like it's one single thing. Like it hits you all at once, and then you just move on. But that's not how it works. It comes in waves. In the quiet moments. When you wake up and instinctively reach for someone who isn't there. When you catch yourself checking your phone, half expecting a message that will never come. When you walk through a store and see her favorite snack on the shelf, and for a split second, you forget. And then you remember. And it guts you all over again. I got her new address in the mail a month later. No note. No explanation. Just an address. She wanted me to know where she was. Maybe so I could find her. Maybe so I wouldn't have to wonder. But I wasn't going to chase her. I had already lost enough of myself in this mess. I wasn't about to lose more. So I did the only thing I could. I took a deep breath, grabbed her unopened whiskey glass, and poured it down the sink. And then, I let her go. For real this time. Not because I forgave her. Not because I was over it. But because I refused to let her be the thing that broke me. She had already taken enough. She wasn't getting anything else. And that's the story. Some betrayals leave you shattered. Some leave you stronger. And some just leave you. But tell me, have you ever had to let go of someone who wasn't holding on to you anymore? Drop your wildest story in the comments. And make sure to subscribe for more untamed tales. Because here at Wives Gone Wild, no story is too messy. No heartbreak is too big. And no one gets away clean.